Hi, everyone. I am Jim Vilmore, and many of us have already spoken in person, and this week and next, I am making the effort to speak to each of you. So we will not have an assignment due. I'll make that clear in an announcement as well for this week. This week, though, I'm going to build off of some of the surveys that you submitted. And one of the most common questions that I received was, what do we do with outlines? I outlined, but now what? That was a consistent question. So I want to go back to outlining and talk a little bit about it today. Now, as a first point, the legal skills lecture is still on YouTube. The link will be provided on Blackboard. If you didn't have legal skills, that presentation may prove useful for you. It's about a half hour long. You can play it at 1.5 speed to make it 20 minutes. But if you watch that and have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'll include that link in the Blackboard site for strategies so that you have it with you. Okay, again, today we're going to be talking about outlining. We're going to discuss briefly the purpose and process of outlining, and then we'll discuss the use of outlines. I'm doing the first point just to make sure we're all on the same page. Now, outlining in general, I think one of the early things you have to remember is that this is your document. One of the most valuable things about outlining, and the reason it's so important, is that it is a tool that forces you to synthesize the material. When you create a document on your own, that's when you do the synthesis of material. It will help you answer your exam questions correctly, and accordingly, organizing that material in an outline and depicting it hierarchically is important, and it reemphasizes the relationship between different legal principles and is generally a very useful structure for understanding how legal information is structured for your class, as well as how you use that information on an exam. So I suggest using time weekly to outline. And I would suggest including that in your weekly study schedule. There's a couple reasons for that. First, it's a very effective review of material from the past week. It plays into the cognitive strategy of spaced repetition, which I brought up with several of you, which I can talk about next week. But it's a very effective way of consolidating memory, especially things you learn early in the semester and you have to remember them for the final. Outlining soon after class is a great benefit to remembering that material when it comes time to perform on the exam. The other reason to do it every week is if you let it pile up, the likelihood that you ever get back to doing it drops precipitously. Of course, doing things along the way makes your life easier, so it's the best approach here as well, to outline every week if you can. And finally, I suggest, for the same reason, starting your outlines earlier in the semester rather than later. Because the longer you wait, the less likely you're going to do it, and you won't get any of the benefits from outlining and from having your outline tool to use. Just as a recap, and so we're all on the same page. An outline is a hierarchical organization of materials for the class. And the information you include in an outline should help you understand the topic with generalities, the scope of your task, the scope of the class that you're outlining for, as well as in the specifics. How does that area of law work? How do you apply a defense to a tort? If there's a prima facie case for tortious conduct, which defenses apply? And how do they apply? Those kind of mechanistic understandings of the law are what you need to demonstrate on exams and what your outline should help you do. But at the same time, it should not and cannot include all of the information from a class. I'm going to evaluate in a separate video my outline that I found from 12 years ago, whatever it was, for torts. I did some things very well. I did some things very poorly. But another question I got was, what does a good outline look like? I'll go through and compare my so-so outline from 12 years ago to some other outlines I have that are really much better. So I want to talk briefly about the process of creating an outline. First, you have to choose what to include. And I've said this to several of you during our meetings, but I want to reemphasize this. Don't organize according to cases. I'll say that again. Do not organize according to cases. That was a reminder. I'm going to talk to one of you in 15 minutes. If you organize, your exam isn't going to be organized according to those cases. Your exam is organized according to concepts and rules. That's the information you need to be facile with in order to perform on your exams. Accordingly, that's what you want to organize around, not cases. The other place to sort of set the scope of your outline is the casebook table of contents, as well as the syllabus. Together, your professor in those two documents, and the author of your book also, and your professor together in those two documents have established the university of law that you'll be using and learning in that class. Therefore, the table of contents and syllabus are great tools for making sure your outline is complete in its scope. After you've made an outline, and remember, we'll look at them in another presentation, short little one, what I always suggest is to condense your outline. Here's what I mean by that. Your initial outline will be very long. You may have case references, examples. You could have all sorts of the rules, explanations, exceptions, all of that material, perhaps policy motivations. And accordingly, that outline will be very long. That's good. It's good to have a document like that. But it won't be the most useful outline or version of that outline that you use. Instead, what I suggest are making multiple forms of your outline. The first one has all the cases and examples in it, and you're able to use it to remind yourself of what happened on a week-to-week basis in class. It may include a bunch of your class notes. But a condensed outline first, and then even more reduced in size, a skeletal outline next, are great tools for honing that rough document of initial outline into a more highly effective tool for your own studying. Here's what I mean by condensed outlines and skeletal outlines. Condensed outlines might contain the headings, the rules, the exceptions perhaps, but it wouldn't include the cases, the case holdings, perhaps the facts of the cases, certainly not, or the examples. I used this condensed outline as a tool in memorizing my rule statements, as well as in grading my exams, as I'll talk about in the next slide. So even more narrow of or even a narrower document, is a skeletal outline. And that's a high-level inventory of the topics that you covered in class. I get rid of, for this outline, all the rules, just keep the headings. That may not sound like a very useful study tool. It isn't. In particulars, the condensed outline is a great study tool. The skeletal outline I always use to remind myself of all the topics that were in the class. And I could look at it every week or two and say, okay, do I know about this stuff? What have we covered so far? And what don't I know? What do I know? For the stuff I don't know, let's go back and utilize some of the tools that we developed in legal skills, tools for helping memorization, tools for helping recall with forced recall and spaced repetition. But the skeletal outline really reminds me of everything that we'll have to cover. And in that sense, it's a good backstop for making sure you aren't missing something in your either condensed or main outline. So these documents, creating these documents is actually part of your exam study. By creating these documents, you're actively engaging with the material and creating a synthesis in your own mind of the materials that you've been grabbing from different places, from Horn books or outline books, your own outline, the text, your class notes, the cases. When you pull all these together into a single document, that synthesis is a great step in the studying process. Okay, now you have an outline. What do you do with it? Couple things. First, I should say that what you shouldn't do with it is to read and reread your outline to memorize. Use other tools to memorize. I'll describe one in a moment. But all that you do when you read your outline and then see if you remember it 5 seconds later is confirming that your working memory is functioning. Congrats, your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is popping along just like it should. However, that doesn't tell you anything about whether you've memorized it. It just doesn't help, because that information will fly out of short-term memory, particularly as you read more things on top of it. Instead, you want to use your outline as a tool in memorizing. So, in first semester, I described something called forced recall. It's a very effective tool at memorizing, and I've discussed it with a lot of you in our calls. But in short, forced recall is best when you're trying to remember the exact language of a rule statement, or the exact elements of a rule. And the way to do it is to start with either a blank piece of paper and a pen, or a blank Word document and a keyboard, and pick a rule. Just for example, pick false imprisonment. Write down the elements and rules of false imprisonment. If you don't remember it, don't check your notes. Leave it there on the page to see. It will demonstrate to you, and you get to see exactly what you know and exactly what you don't know. And what do you compare the rule that you remembered against? Well, you compare it against your outline. So you can check your rule statements not only when you're doing the memorizing of the rules, but also in essays. You can use your outlines to evaluate your essays. Not only the rule statements, which can be done in the way I just described, but also all of in your most complete version of an outline, you'll have all of the exceptions and examples. See if you can go through there and find, as you're evaluating your essay, see if you can find examples that line up with the facts that you looked at, or maybe a case lines up with it, and see if your analysis in the essay matches the analysis from that example, case, or hypothetical. It's a very effective way of both synthesizing material in your outline as well as using it profitably to prepare for your exams.